The Costa Concordia was a marvel of modern maritime engineering. At 114,000 tons, it was the largest Italian cruise ship ever built, equipped with fully integrated navigation systems, automated track controls, and redundant sensor arrays. Yet, on the night of January 13, 2012, it lay capsized off the coast of Italy. This highly defended, heavily automated floating city was ultimately brought down by one of the most primitive hazards on Earth, a stationary, charted rock. This chart shows the intended voyage. The dark gray line represents the standard safe passage from Civitavecchia to Savona. But that evening, the ship deviated. The red line charts a sharp course driving the vessel directly toward the shallow waters of Giglio Island. Public discussions heavily focused on the captain's individual recklessness. While his actions were critical, attributing the loss of a modern cruise ship to a single bad actor oversimplifies the mechanics of failure in highly complex systems. To understand this, we look at the organizational accident model. It separates causation into two layers. Active failures are the immediate human errors by operators at the controls. Latent conditions are dormant systemic flaws, like poor training or broken procedures, hidden within the organization. The grounding was the inevitable kinetic result of 6 sequential active failures that systematically pierced the ship's defenses. Leaving the open water of the standard route meant bringing a vessel with an 8-meter draft into an environment of shallow, unforgiving rock. The sequence began with the first error. The captain decided to alter the approved voyage plan to execute a touristic navigation, a close-range sail pass to salute a retired colleague living on the island. In safety science, this is classified as a rule-based error. It was an informal, normalized practice that deviated from strict protocols. Given the winter season and late hour, it served no functional organizational goal, yet it was allowed to proceed. This single decision pushed the vessel into an undesired ship state, an operational phase where safety margins are drastically reduced, and the environment becomes highly intolerant of subsequent mistakes. This chart shows the second error. Plotting the new route on a 1 to 100,000 scale map is a fatal planning flaw. At this wide scale, the map entirely lacks the granular depth detail required for close coastal maneuvering, even though much more precise charts were available. Working off this inadequate map, the captain established a safety margin of 0.5 nautical miles. However, he measured this distance from a generic, visible point on the islands, rather than the true boundary of danger. Proper maritime procedure dictates calculating the safety margin from the 10-meter bathymetric line, the underwater contour where the water becomes too shallow for the ship's draft. The visible shore is irrelevant if an invisible shelf extends hundreds of meters beneath the surface. Before the Concordia even approached Giglio, the soft defenses of procedural planning had failed. The crew was navigating blind, relying on flawed parameters. With procedural planning compromised, the ship's safety relied entirely on bridge resource management, the protocols dictating how the human team monitors data and communicates during active navigation. The third error occurred when the junior officer of the watch abandoned her station. Her primary duty was to constantly plot the ship's position on the paper charts, but she left the chart table. She stepped away to assist the helmsman, exposing a severe latent condition on the bridge, an English and Italian language barrier. The helmsman required translation to understand helm orders. By optimizing an informal workaround, translating commands to ensure the ship steered correctly, the team neutralized their primary method of tracking the ship's exact location. This forced the senior officer of the watch to rely on the wrong instrumentation. He attempted to judge their distance from shore using the radar, but radar signals only bounce off objects extending above the waterline. By looking at the radar, the officer entirely missed what lay directly in their path, an outer, submerged rock sitting just 7.3 meters below the surface. This screen shows the ship's electronic navigation chart. The blue shaded zones clearly display the 10-meter safety contour. The system possessed the precise data needed to save the vessel. The software features automated chart alarms designed to trigger if the ship's trajectory intersects with this safety contour. Those alarms were either ignored, silenced, or improperly configured by the crew. Advanced hard defenses like integrated navigation systems are functionally useless if the human operators misunderstand the system's logic and monitor the wrong sensors. At 5 nautical miles from the island, the situation escalated. Despite using the wrong instruments, the senior officer of the watch realized they were approaching too fast and too close. Recognizing the degrading safety margin, he prepared to initiate a course alteration to starboard to pull the ship away from the hazard. Then the fifth error happened. The captain arrived on the bridge, took direct control without conducting a formal handover of data, and immediately stopped the senior officer's safety correction. This was a catastrophic failure of resource management, driven by the latent condition of an autocratic command culture. Without clear parameters for when an officer should challenge the captain, the team fell silent. Looking at this display, the captain made a unilateral decision to cut the planned margin in half, committing the ship to a distance of just 0.25 nautical miles from the radar echoes. This set the stage for the sixth and final error, a complete breakdown in physical ship handling during the turn itself. Operating at close range in the dark, the captain abandoned the instrument data. He shifted to what is known as knowledge-based performance, improvising the turn by relying on his naked eye to judge the distance to the dark mass of the island. This reliance on human depth perception at night caused him to initiate the maneuver far too late. He began issuing specific rudder angles to the helmsman, rather than commanding a precise, controlled rate of turn. The physics of a 290-meter vessel dictate that when the bow turns sharply, the pivot point forces the stern to sweep outward. Even when the captain finally ordered hard starboard, the ship's massive momentum carried the aft hull directly into the submerged 7.3-meter rock. Human expertise is the absolute final layer of defense in any complex system. Here, it was completely neutralized by improvisation, cognitive overload, and the sheer momentum of a 114,000-ton vessel. The physical impact was simply the kinetic endpoint of a multi-hour systemic collapse. We can trace the escalation of this collapse using this threat and error management flowchart. An external threat was met with active human errors. Mismanaged, they pushed the vessel into an undesired ship state, flowing unchecked into a catastrophic accident. 6 discrete active failures allowed this to happen: the route deviation, flawed paper planning, the junior officer abandoning the map, using the wrong radar data, the captain's autocratic override, and the final late turn. But treating an organizational accident by focusing exclusively on these active human errors is like trying to catch individual mosquitoes in a swamp. You are chasing the symptoms, not the source. Removing the specific individuals involved does not eliminate the underlying conditions that made their errors possible and even probable. To prevent recurrence, you have to drain the swamp. You must address the latent conditions woven into the organization's fabric: normalized deviation in voyage planning, unaddressed language barriers on the bridge, a culture of alarm fatigue, and rigid autocratic hierarchies. These latent conditions can lie dormant for years, perfectly tolerated during normal operations. They only become lethal on the night they perfectly align, opening a straight-line path through the system's defenses. Friction between human psychology and operational protocol causes complex systems to fail, regardless of the sophistication of their underlying technology. True safety engineering requires looking past the sharp end of the accident. It requires relentlessly interrogating the blunt organizational factors that quietly set the stage for disaster long before the